everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Clear as Mud, where we talk to game developers from all walks of life to discuss their personal and professional journeys. I'm your host, Graham Waldrop. As always, our show is presented by Mudstack, the only asset management and collaboration tool custom built for game studios and digital artists. For more information, head over to mudstack.com. Today, you'll meet Nikhil Kashyap, game designer for Meta. Nikhil has worked in a number of different mediums, including journalism, documentary filmmaking, authoring a novel, and creating a new form of interactive theater. We also discuss his game design philosophy and how that impacted his work on Concrete Genie VR and in the Horizon Metaverse. We hope you enjoy meeting Nikhil, and I'll see you after the interview to wrap up the show. So Nikhil, as a game designer, how'd you get into games?
I think my path to games sort of begins with like how I started to play games. And it's like a little bit of an interesting story. I had an interesting childhood in that my childhood was split across 3 different countries. I grew up age 1 to 10 in the Bay Area, then a few years in the UK before moving back to India, which is where I was born.
Where were you hopping around everywhere? What was your family doing?
My parents were explorers, man. They just wanted to see the world. They're actually also the first of their family to leave their state, let alone just their country. So yeah, I think they were explorers at heart. However, for them, they always saw their time abroad as like a time-boxed period, and home was always India for them. So yeah, eventually we moved back to India. At the time, I spoke my native tongue very poorly, and so it was actually quite challenging to forge connections with my peers at the time, like people my own age. And strangely, video games became this like interesting medium that I brought back from the West that became the platform for those initial relationships to grow. Like just lots of hours after school, like playing games like Street Fighter, Evil Zone on the PlayStation, Ridge Racer 4. Yeah, so it kind of became a springing board to help develop friendships. Yeah, fast forward like several years after graduating college. I did not really grow up in a cultural environment where video games was even in the atmosphere of what a career could be. So I actually like stumbled into video games. I consider myself like very, very fortunate.
Were you always just interested in like game design in general, or were you interested in other like aspects of the industry, interested in art at all, or programming or producing or anything like that?
I wish I had artistic bones in my body. Since in the last few years, I've tried to like dabble in drawing and painting, but very much as a hobbyist. I actually started my career in the industry as an engineer. So I have, yes, my undergraduate degree was in computer science, which is often an incredibly helpful skill set to a game designer as well. But my first job was actually as a gameplay engineer. And it was an interesting experience in that, like, I really enjoyed the job. I learned so much. However, I think it became quickly apparent to me that I was much more interested in the why questions for video games, as in why is the game the way it is, what should we make, as opposed to the how questions that engineering asks, which is how do we make this feature, how do we scale this, how do we get this to be performant. So yeah, it was the first kind of like pivot points towards game design.
I mean, I would think that being a programmer initially will spark that question, right? I mean, do you think you would have wound up doing what you're doing today had you not started on the engineering side?
I think people enter game design with lots of different types of backgrounds. Like I've seen game designers with degrees in psychology, history. However, I think the type of game designer you become is often like forged by like what your hard skill set is. And like having a technical skill set like allows you to do things like prototyping or even scripting systems, which is an incredibly valuable skill set. Like you become the bridge between engineers and other game designers. So yeah, I definitely see the engineering degree as like a very vital step towards my game design career.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's always been a struggle for me when I was at school for game design, and then when I worked in the industry a little bit. I could dictate, right, what I wanted from a design standpoint. I could do some level design stuff as well. But in terms of like the scripting, it was always a challenge for me. Programming has never, I don't know, like it's just I'm horrible at math. I don't know if that has something to do with it, and also just understanding languages. Like we were looking at C# and things like that, and I worked in processing a little bit as well, and it was always just such a challenge for me. And I think that kind of limited my ability to sort of get the ideas out I wanted sometimes, unless I was working with a team. Like I couldn't really do anything by myself. It was like, if I'm with a team, I can say, this is what I want to happen at this specific moment. And I could do a couple of things, but I could never, sit there and, figure out how a bunch of mechanics are going to work and actually implement that. So I was always jealous of people who could do that, because I tried. I just couldn't quite master it. So
Totally. I mean, our education not just creates vocational skill set, it also sort of forges the way we think, right?
Yeah.
And I think in the past, there were very sharp delineations between game design and engineering. And those boundaries are very blurry now, and
Yeah.
necessarily so, because I think getting your hands dirty with game engines and like scripting is effectively a game designer's language, in the same way that like screenplays might be the language for a movie writer.
Right.
Like making prototypes and scripting systems is just so core to the experience, to being a game designer, because you must experience fun. Like fun cannot be hypothesized on a paper. It can be a great starting point to paper prototype and discuss ideas before you start to prototype, because even prototyping is often expensive, and there are only so many swings of the bat you get.
Yeah.
But I think if I were to whenever I give advice to students who don't have technical backgrounds, who are interested in game design, it's always, you must start to build in engine.
Yeah.
Like you don't need a degree in computer science for that, but just a basic proficiency in scripting is like at this point a mandate in order to break into the industry, I think.
Yeah, I think implementation and iteration are so key in terms of when you're actually building out. And yeah, you're exactly right. You're never going to know how something's going to work unless you actually get into engine. Even if it's just blocks moving around, that gives you an idea of how your game's going to hopefully work and what you need to start changing.
Totally. And often even technical designers will get assistance from engineers in terms of like, hey, this piece of vector math is like way too complex for me to figure out. Can you help me with this? Or can you create for me an underlying system that then I just plug my prototype into? But that is a better starting point for that conversation with engineering, rather than, I wrote a design document, please implement this as a prototype.
Right. And that's just so impersonal too, right? Just like, here's everything that you need to do, now go do it. And it's like, that's going to change so much. You can like you have the ideas, you wrote them all down, you start implementing it, you might as well just tear that thing up and start again.
Absolutely. And I think it's like game engines, over-the-shelf game engines like Unity and Unreal have just been so instrumental in allowing this sort of blurring between game design and engineering. Because like writing C# code or writing blueprints in Unreal Engine is a lot more understandable and is kind of like disambiguated from C++ or underlying like native code that game engines use. And it's like really interesting to see how there are lots of different layers of creation now. Like what I work on at the moment at Meta as a game designer is on a creation platform called Horizon, which is, you can think of it as like an even more accessible platform than Unity or Unreal. It's really like, it's almost like writing English, as it were. It's getting closer to that. It's much more understandable. There's still logical constructs like if, like iteration loops and like for loops and while loops and all of that. But A lot of the interface itself is just drag and drop of these different what are called code blocks. And so there's not the need to like think of syntax or compilation errors and all of kind of the semantics of it. And I think we'll like continue to see those lines blur, like as like the industry, as user generated content for different platforms becomes important. Like we want a lot more variety of people creating games.
Yeah, and I think things like Little Big Planet, that series
Totally.
really inspired a bunch of people because you didn't need to know anything about coding. It was just about making sure things are work, like the tools. They would give you the tools to do it, but you didn't have to know anything about if statements or booleans or whatever, right? You could just go in there and do it. I mean, you had to like know when things would. You had to have an idea and figure it out, but the tools were there, and it was just it was a fascinating breakthrough, I think, in terms of making game design so much more accessible. And I think Unreal and Unity, although it's more complicated to do things in there, has also just broken down so many barriers in terms of just getting people in the door, making it accessible. And now you have so many indie games coming out all the time, every day. And I think it's just a wonderful step forward for the industry in terms of creating. We're just getting so many more new games now, and there are games for everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, I see it almost as a spectrum of barrier to entry for creation. Like more recent, you cited Little Big Planet, which is a great example. There's also Dreams on the PlayStation platform.
Yeah, same developer, Media Molecule. Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think even historically, games like the Elder Scrolls games had like a very, very rich modding community. And that's kind of an interesting like source of creation unto itself, right? Like I have a deep connection with this piece of content and I wish to add to it. So yeah, I think the interesting trade-offs there in creating those types of platforms is often like when you lower barrier to entry of creation, you make things more accessible, but you also kind of lower the ceiling of complexity of games that you can make on that platform or content that you can make on that platform.
There's always so far you can go in a way, right?
Exactly.
Like even with something like Dreams or Little Big Planet, it's like it's still just the tools that the developers have created as opposed to you creating your own scripts and things like that.
Totally. Like compared to Unity or Unreal, where like effectively any game can be made, any creative vision can be realized, while like usually like modding tools and tools like Dream offer you a much smaller play area. But I think it's great. I think like often creators level up. Like a lot of game designers that I've heard on podcasts and other platforms started off their careers making mods and dabbling. So I think people often level up through these different tools.
Yeah, it is inspiring to hear things like that. I remember, or actually Jordan, our CEO, was talking about how I can't remember if it was Halo or another game, but there's some game with where you could create levels. And it was like, this is like the first germ that kind of got in his head. It's like, oh, you can actually this is how you can create stuff. And I can't imagine the amount of people that have had that same thought of just getting one opportunity to create something in a game and be like, oh, that was cool. Let me explore that more.
Totally. Yeah, creation is just an incredibly inherent part of the human condition, I think.
Yeah, it's like we're compelled to do it. There's something instinctual about it.
Yeah. I mean, often, like, novelists start off as bloggers or journalers, like very young high school kids, like, don't write novels. They start journaling, and then it becomes just the seed that, like, never leaves. It grows into, like, a more rich creative outlet.
We're all just one big iterative process at the end of the day.
That's right. I like that. Our lives are iterative processes, just like making games.
Exactly. So you've dabbled in other areas, though, speaking of journalism and writing. I'd be interested to hear some more about that.
Totally. Between my first job that I mentioned at Disney Interactive and graduate school at Carnegie Mellon, I took a gap year, almost a gap year and a half. I traveled for quite a bit, did a 3-month backpacking trip in Europe. And yeah, I dabbled in broadcast journalism to start off. Worked with a large media conglomerate called NDTV in India. It was called New Delhi Television. Started off as a broadcast journalist. I worked on a few documentaries, and then
cool.
kind of like pivoted towards online journalism. And I think this sort of like dabbling in different mediums is just like so important for any creative. Like even if you feel like you have discovered your calling with a particular medium, because like we tend to get very passionate about our mediums, right? Like game designers and game developers are very passionate about games, but there's so much opportunity to learn. Like even though journalism seems like something that is so disconnected from the process of making games, I think the skill that I really learned being a journalist was the skill of listening, and like listening deeply, because I think as a game designer, so much of your job is listening to lots of various different types of stakeholders, creative directors, artists, people who play test your game. All of these are sources of feedback. And like often it is the game designer's job to synthesize all of that into something that feels coherent. And so I am convinced that like active listening is one of the most important skills for a game designer. And it's also a pretty good skill to have in life.
Yeah, definitely. And the documentary standpoint, you got to listen a lot too to your subjects.
100%. But yeah, I've also, in that gap year, also managed to write a novel that was semi-autobiographical.
What's it called?
It's called Lost in Transition.
In Transition, okay.
Transition,
yeah.
not
Yeah, I was thinking, like, wait a minute, there's a there's a movie called that.
Right. Horribly named novel. Should have like definitely thought of like overlaps, but anyway, that's the name of the book. But yeah, I managed to publish that in 2017, which was a really cool experience.
Oh, cool. Was that would you self-publish it, or did you find a publisher?
I did not. I found a publisher.
Oh, great.
This was the publisher's name is Loxley Hall. It's like they're owned. I think they're a subsidiary of a larger British publisher. But I was once again kind of very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. They were looking to set up a publishing house in the domestic market in India. And I was kind of like the first batch of books that they published.
Cool. So what part of your life is covered in your book?
Yeah. So I mentioned the 3-month backpacking trip to Europe. That is a large portion of the novel, but it kind of has a dual timeline where it's like flitting back and forth between this character's journey traveling, but also going back to his childhood as a youth, exploring his sexuality in a fairly homophobic environment, or in an environment that doesn't really recognize homosexuality as a source of one's identity. So yeah, it's like it's a coming of age story. A lot. It's very, very young adult, very dramatic. I think it's like impossible to, like as a writer, when you look back at work that you've constructed when you're young, there's always a little bit of cringiness involved there, but
for sure.
But I'm glad it exists, and I'm glad some people have read it, because I think it's important for people's stories to be recognized through media.
Yeah, I like that storytelling structure you got. It reminds me a little of Godfather 2, kind of going back and forth between different timelines. Was that what influenced you to kind of pick these two different sort of narrative branches?
I think those were just two very formative periods in my life. Like the backpacking trip to Europe was like the first time that I, as an individual, like saw or met other gay men, and like recognized this as someone you could be.
Right.
While like I grew up in an environment where the only sources where my identity was recognized was through films and like other types of media, and like until that backpacking trip at 23, I had like quite literally not met another individual with the same sexuality as me. Yeah. So I think it was very cathartic, the process of writing it. And I think this is often true for junior writers. Like, you write to express, you write to release some type of trauma you've had in the past.
Yeah, it sounds very personal, and it sounds like the juxtaposition between the horrors of the past and, I guess, the pleasures you found in the present. I mean, that's a powerful contrast there.
Totally.
That sounds like a really cool story, and a very just like intimate story. Is it available to read still? Is it still out?
It is available.
Okay, I might have to check it out.
I'm happy to send you. Yeah, I'd love that. I think that aspect of flitting back and forth between two timelines is a very also like common narrative structure, since like you cannot have the entirety of a story in the past, because then the audience or the reader won't really care about it unless there's conflict in the present.
Right.
And so I think the narrative structure of these is often the past is setting context for what you are about to see.
Yeah, and if that makes those moments more powerful too, because it's like you're setting up, all these things you went through, and then you're realizing. I mean, I don't know, I haven't read it, but it just sounds like it's very fertile, rich narrative soil to sort of set up this character, you, that is just going through all this stuff and then sort of having this release, right? And just being able to breathe.
Absolutely.
And you're not going to feel the relief of that unless you get that context from the past. So I think I definitely want to check it out.
Yeah. I think it's an extension. That narrative structure comes from the extension of show don't tell. Like, you have to not just tell your protagonist's backstory, you must also show it.
Yeah, like I would hate, I always hated in movies and stuff when it's like, oh, remember that time we went to this place and did that and it was so much fun. It's like, well, that'd be nice to see.
Yeah.
That might give me some context for this relationship, as opposed to you just tell me about it and two people who went through it and know it are talking about it, and then here I am as an audience member being like, yeah, great guys, carry on, I guess.
I think you see a lot of that in student films, because like student films are so bound by budgets and constraints, and like you're usually filming with nothing, with no money involved at all, right? So there's less opportunity to be filming in multiple locations and showing a character's past, and so it ends up just being exposition vomit.
Yeah, that's one of my most hated things when I watch a movie or read a script, is just like a big old exposition dump, vomit, whatever you want to call it. It's like, God, I wish I could just see it.
Totally.
Like it's so interesting when writing, I think, when it's like I sort of do something. I dabble in indie film, and I've written screenplays and whatnot, and the thing I always wind up doing, which I never mean to do, is I overwrite all the dialogue, I overwrite character motivations. I have people say what they're thinking, and then I go back and be like, okay, strip all that out and just try to make it as subtle as possible. Still have the feeling, but we don't need to hear all that.
Totally.
We don't need to hear all that.
Yeah.
So much more can be said with a look, a glance, etc.
You got to get it all out there, though, in the first draft. You have to.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's when it's messy, and that's okay.
It's messy by design, because that is kind of the clay that you create to then like chip away and forge.
Yeah, definitely. So that sort of brings me to the next thing I want to talk about. Where'd you say you went to graduate school again?
I went to graduate school at Carnegie Mellon's Entertainment Technology Center.
Right, so that's where you made
Pennsylvania.
That's where you made your theater/interactive project, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah, so tell us about that. It's called Give Me Your Gun, right?
Yeah, so Give Me Your Gun was really this like experiment, and this is why university and academia is such a great place for games, because like the production and the business of making games, even indie games, comes with so many tight constraints, and it's just a really hard business. And I definitely wish there's more games from academia that are actually published and see the light of day, because it's a great place to explore. But Give Me Your Gun was born from this idea of like, how do we bring games and theater together? So in the experience, you have every member of the audience with their cell phones out, and they have a portal that they can use to type in questions and then also vote for questions from other audience members. And then questions with the highest number of votes is voiced through one of the characters on stage. So in a way, the audience is collectively role-playing through this character.
How much time do they have to vote on what the question should be or what the response should be?
Yeah. Getting the flow of that experience right was like a large part of like the development process. But that sort of timing question becomes less relevant as the experience progresses, because there's just a constant flow of questions from the audience, and they can continuously vote. So like we only kind of deprecate questions as not being relevant like when the narrative has progressed past a certain point. So like the act of like voting for questions and typing in questions is more the attempted like user experience is that it is seamless and it is smooth.
What are they submitting? Were they submitting their questions with like a smartphone or a computer, or how does that work?
Yeah, it was mostly through a web portal.
Web portal. Okay.
Yeah, so I think a large part of this of designing any experience is like also thinking of the medium and platform and like how eventually this will be experienced. And this was a project that was sponsored by an organization called Games for Change, which is based out of New York City. So this was the intended audience for this was the intended home for this project was a conference that the Games for Change holds every year called the Games for Change Conference. So when the audience members kind of like start to settle into their seats, we present a QR code that you scan to then hit this web portal.
Okay, yeah, and it sounds like it's sort of a choose your own adventure thing, but you can really see what's happening. Yeah. Which I think is cool.
I think choose your own adventure is a good touching stone to think about it, but I think more of D&D. I think more. Okay. I think more of Twitch. I think of role play. I think where the choose your own adventure doesn't map over is that choose your own adventure is ultimately just a branching storyline with finite paths. Right? Mm-hmm. There's a set of like pre-described paths and conclusions that you will eventually get to, while you might have some sense of a narrative that you want to arrive at with D&D, but the way you get there is infinite and varied, and I think that was kind of the goal for this to be particularly trying to utilize the medium of theater. Because like you have two humans who are capable of responding on the fly to people's questions. So this was very much a mixture of improv and live theater.
Yeah. And then so I think that's got to be tricky, though, because right when you give the audience too much control of a narrative, it could potentially like undercut the thematic elements of what your story is about or the journey your characters need to go on. So how did you balance that in terms of like, we're still going to, like you were saying, we're still going to get to this conclusion, right? But the way we get there may be entirely different.
Totally. And I think that's where the game design element comes into the picture. So like you provide people with a form of interactivity, but often like game design contextualizes that interactivity. So in this case, we give the audience a problem to solve. Like this character, in the narrative, there are two friends who are having a conversation, and one of the friends discovers that her friend has a gun in her purse. And so that's kind of the inciting incident. And so the problem that we ask the audience to solve is, what is this character's motivation for owning this gun? And so hopefully the audience is then like filtering their questions through that lens. So they're not trying to break the experience in asking like inane, mundane questions that are not relevant to the narrative. Like you make them care about the character.
Well, that's a great stepping off point, because it could be for any reason, right? She could be a homicidal maniac, self-defense. She's going to kill her friend for some reason. The list could go on and on and on.
Yeah, I think some of my learnings from that project was, I think in a way we made our lives harder by picking such a dense subject matter. I think potentially that format, which to the best of my knowledge is like very novel. Like I have not had any experience in interactive theater where the audience has that level of agency.
Right.
Like improv starts with asking for a setting and some character backstory, but from then on, it's really the show.
Yeah.
Whereas here, you are an active participant and like you have agency throughout the experience. But I think that structure may have lent itself better to comedy, where you could go absurd. It could kind of go wherever it wants to, and like that is, I think, why improv is usually comedic in nature, right? Like those two things, like you could visualize improv being much more like somber and like tackling difficult subjects, but that's not usually how improv goes. Like improv is funny, and it's because I think people want, when they're given a tool of interactivity that is that broad, they just kind of want to have fun with it and they want to play with it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about improv too, because I like going to improv theater quite a bit and watching how actors process things. And I remember one person from the audience, they were asking about what the subject should be, and someone said suicide, and this person just like, the actor didn't know what to do, and it was very awkward. And it wasn't like the good time everybody wanted. And he tried to make it somewhat serious, somewhat funny, but it was just kind of a disaster. So yeah, I totally agree that improv should lean more towards the comedic. Or if you can pull off a dramatic thing, great. But the guy was also on his own, so it was really hard. I can't imagine from an actor standpoint how you would even begin to process what you would do with that.
Yeah. I think drama is also, it has different challenges. I'm not trying to say it's harder than comedy, but it requires narrative beats, and it requires like more tight structure.
Yeah.
Like in order to have like this emotional payoff.
Yeah, and for the character to really have like a spine too, like you have to build something out there.
Exactly. There needs to be seated conflict, and like you have to see the character change through that conflict. So there are just a lot more steps to get to an emotional point, I think.
So last question I have on this, and I can talk about this project all day, I think it's pretty darn fascinating, is from an acting standpoint, how the actors sort of reconcile with this sort of new medium you were trying to create, and how did you communicate the responses from the audience to them? So
we tried to fold that communication aspect as props into the narrative. So in the experience, the setting is that these two friends are preparing for a party, and so every once in a while, there's a reason for the actor to glance at her phone. And this is the medium through which we're delivering like what the audience is asking, or the most top voted question.
That's smart.
To her. So yeah, she is like occasionally glancing towards the phone for time and things like that.
That's great, because that keeps that actor engaged 100%.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very smart. So, yeah, it sounds like it wasn't really like a break where it's like, let's stop to ask the audience something. It just kept going and kept rolling.
Absolutely. Good. I think it was like very important to us for the experience to feel smooth and seamless. And it should have all of the seamlessness of a live theater show.
Yeah, because that would break immersion if there was a pause.
Exactly. There's also a projection screen behind the actors, where the audience has a lot more kind of like clear feedback as to what is going on. So like, for instance, like we capture key facts for these characters on that projection screen. We have like a series of the next 2 or 3 questions that is going to be voiced through the actors, the top voted questions. So the audience is getting a lot more feedback that they need in order to frame their questions and think about what do they want the character to say next. But we didn't want the actors to be glancing back at that projection screen.
Right.
Like it's removed from the stage in a way.
Okay. Is there a way to watch this online anywhere?
There is. There's a promotional video that we put out that kind of explains our process, that explains just everything that went into the making of. But there's also, I believe, a video of the entire experience at the conference itself. That's where you could check it out.
Cool. Yeah, I would definitely like to see that, because I watched the 3-minute video and I was like, man, this is a hell of an idea.
It's definitely a fun project.
So pivoting back to more traditional game design. You also worked on Concrete Genie, the VR expansion version for PlayStation. Tell us a little bit about that.
I did, yes. That was also an incredibly rewarding, rich project to work on. So that game, Concrete Genie, was developed by PlayStation Studios. Also, I think I should also mention upfront that I'm not a spokesperson for Sony or Pixel Opus, which is the studio that I'll be talking about in any way. Like, everything that I'm saying is only a representation of my views and not that of the company. There, disclaimer out of the way. But yes, I was a part of Sony's first-party studios that most gamers associate with like big, massive games like God of War and The Last of Us and Horizon Forbidden West. But our studio's name was Pixel Opus, or is Pixel Opus. And we were tasked with making what we called games with heart, which is a phrase that I just love and adore. And I think the entire team really took that phrase to heart. So we work on like slightly more non-traditional games. Like the primary mechanic in Concrete Genie is painting, where the goal for the game is to really make everyone feel like an artist. So instead of just giving you colors on a palette, we give you templates. So you might be given a tree brush, or you might be given a mushroom brush or a wind brush, and you use these brushes to like create and decorate art on walls with a narrative guiding you through, because like Sony is known for making world-class narrative games. So this is very much a narrative-oriented game, but has a very novel mechanic.
Yeah, the one thing I liked about it, I played it some last night for the first time, was that the blending of different art styles, because it's set in this 3D, stylized 3D world with characters that kind of resembled like stop motion animation to me in a way, at least especially with the facial animation. And then it combines with the main character Ash's creations, which are hand drawn, and then melding them together. Like when you're painting in that game, you're painting sort of that 2D style into the 3D world. And I thought that was just a wonderful combination of different aesthetics. And it was I think it's a visual feast. I mean, I was really enjoying it. I'm definitely gonna finish it, but it was a really, really cool idea. I've never really seen something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the art folks at Pixel Opus are just extraordinary. The entire team is extraordinary, but the art folks also. I think what's really cool about Pixel Opus in particular is that there's so many novel games on Steam. Like there are tons of like interesting experimental games, but they don't have the same reach that a game that is backed by like one of the world's largest media publishers, Sony, has. So in a way, I kind of see like Pixel Opus as being uniquely positioned to deliver like novel gameplay, but through kind of the lens and the package of a format that people can understand, like a narrative game that with a huge demographic and following. So yeah, art style features so prominently into making it feel accessible and like grounding it.
Yeah, definitely. So walk us through your specific role in the VR portion of it.
So when the VR component to this experience was spun up, that's about the time when I joined. The main console game itself was about, I want to say, a couple of years in development. So there was already the spine for what Concrete Genie, the quote-unquote main console game, was. So our team's mandate, the VR team's mandate, was to think about like, how does this game get adapted to VR? And an instinctive response from people, like we got this question a lot from playtesters, is that why can't we just play the main game in VR? Mm-hmm. And the answer to that is VR is its own medium with its own like design requirements and design challenges, and just putting a console game in a 3D medium is is not the best way to utilize that medium. Like there is a massive difference between pressing buttons on a controller to moving your hands and having presence in a world. So yeah, through a series of prototypes, we kind of discovered this idea that we called 3D painting. When we thought that's a really cool way to embellish what Concrete Genie, the console game, was. So in Concrete Genie, you're painting on walls. So what if in VR, when you come in, you go from painting on a wall to creating three-dimensional objects and actually growing objects in the world and pulling a tree out of the ground and creating an entire atmosphere and world around you. So yeah, that's where most of my work was centered on. I was centered on thinking about how do we make each of these brushes or these templates delightful in a VR context? So like, what does it mean to shape a tree through gesturing through your hands? Like, what does it mean to command a gust of wind through gestural motion?
And I think this game lends itself to VR. This world lends itself to VR because when I was playing it last night, I was like a lot of shaking of the controller. When you're painting something. But I imagine when you're in VR, it's so much more intuitive. And you guys switched to first person perspective for the VR one, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, VR. So like it's third person in the regular game, but yeah, the VR. And with how great the art style is, I mean, it just must be. I imagine it would just be much more immersive. I don't have a VR headset, but I would like to see more of what the VR experience is like, because it's like, man, getting into that world and not being limited to walls. I mean, that must have just been freeing from a design perspective.
Oh, yeah. I think at a very high level, like the reason our team was spun up for VR was probably that exact reason. Like the experience was begging for virtual reality. It's like painting is an act that is just so gestural. It uses your entire body. So it made perfect sense for it to be in VR. Yeah.
And how long did that take to finish up?
The project lasted about 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so even though it's like a very short experience, there was just so much iteration that went into developing like what is the structure around this interactivity, because it's like it's fine, as I was kind of mentioning with Give Me Your Gun, it's really cool to have a novel interaction mechanic, but how does that get contextualized? How do you build an experience around that is like often very challenging when your interaction is novel, because it like breaks from like formulas and you don't really have any North Stars to point towards, so you have to kind of make your own North Star, as it were.
Was that your first VR development experience?
I did some VR development in college, but that was like my first quote unquote real project. My first real virtual project. How's that? Yeah.
It's a totally different ballgame. Some people who work with us now at Mudstack at another company we worked at, we developed a VR application on Gear VR and Oculus. And that was in like 2016. And we were using Unity as our engine. And it was just a totally, totally different experience than ever trying to just traditional development. There's just so much more to consider.
I think like in a way VR adds a dimension, right? So like if you think of the difference between film and video games add a dimension, which is interactivity. And what VR adds on top of all of that is another dimension, which is embodiment. And that embodiment has to feature as an extremely important like design consideration. And often there are trade-offs to be made between embodiment and gameplay. Like it's, for instance, like when you go from like film to console games, like in a way, sometimes narrative has to take a backstage to interactivity, because making something fun might mean certain narrative compromises. Similarly, I think when you go to VR, I don't think the goal is to just make a fun experience. It's often challenging to make a game that is pure just fun. Because like there's so much stimulus that you have in VR. Like you can look around, your attention is being pulled in lots of different directions.
Right. And so then it's like, what is fun, right? Everybody's definition of fun is different. So there's
absolutely.
that too.
Absolutely. I think in this case, when I say fun, I mean the act of overcoming obstacles. Like in a console, a very common like action adventure game will have enemies who have certain verbs, and you, the player, has certain verbs, and you're kind of involved in this tug of war of like, how do I kill this enemy, right? And so much of that is based on like the ability to very easily execute actions. Like a single press of a button on your controller executes an action. While in VR, that doesn't always make sense. Like you have hands, and so the action must be embodied. So maybe it's not so fun to like physically punch an enemy 10 times in a row using your hands.
Right.
And that's what I mean by there are trade-offs involved with embodiment and creating like that sort of traditional fun.
Yeah. And I think it's still such a young medium in terms of its current incarnation that who knows where it's going to go in the future in terms of like, yeah, you're talking about all the different ways you can move around. You actually have hands, you know, it's not just you're a camera, you're an avatar with some buttons. It's like you're you kind of in the VR experience now. Absolutely.
I think in a way, this is sort of why the most still to date successful VR experiences, the VR experiences that a large swath of the public has heard of, things like Beat Saber, Super Hot, are not games that are kind of forged from traditional console-based games with that format of narrative, combat. Like it's very, very different than that. And that's because those games really lean into embodiment.
Yeah, and they rely on like very specific mechanics that are easily repeatable.
Exactly. Yeah, like you cannot really deconstruct Beat Saber back onto a console screen. Like it is only possible in VR.
Right.
And I think it's a testament that sort of, I guess Beat Saber came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago, perhaps longer, is still kind of the killer app. Well, there have been like lots of attempts to make games that look more familiar to gamers, but in VR, that are really cool. Like there are games like Asgard's Wrath by Sanzaru, there's Stormland by Insomniac Games, that kind of have that action adventure format, but I don't think have like achieved the same level of success that something as simple and arcadey as Beat Saber has.
So after that, you moved on to Meta, right?
I did, yes.
And you're working on Meta Horizon.
That's correct. I work on a social VR platform called Horizon. Horizon is really a place where you can hang out in social spaces, like virtual homes, visit other worlds. You can go to events. I think Post Malone performed a virtual concert in Horizon recently. You can, of course, play games. And I think most importantly, and this is kind of where I think Horizon really shines, is you can create your own worlds. And you can create these worlds collaboratively with other people in VR.
From your standpoint as a designer, that's got to just open up a whole new toolbox. I mean, like there's mechanics and controls in every game, but in terms of what you can actually implement, what you can actually give the players the freedom to do, it seems like you can go further than your average game because there's so much to do. And it's also live, right? So you're consistently updating it, I would imagine. Yeah,
absolutely. I think in the future, there will kind of be a separate category of game designer job title that is created for this type of role, because it's very, very different, as you outlined. Like in most games, like a game designer's job is to make the game as fun as possible. And of course, the experiences that I currently work on are also striving to be fun, but that is not the only consideration. Our primary goal is to empower and kind of inspire a creator ecosystem. Like, for example, I recently wrapped a project that we call Diamond Defense, which is out on the Horizon platform that you can experience right now and enjoy. But it is an action RPG experience where it's kind of like a wave horde based RPG experience where you're leveling up certain weapons and you're getting further and further into the dungeon. But the goal for this project, apart from being fun, was to kind of extract out of this a sort of template that other creators can go and make their own RPG. So it's kind of like a starting off point that other creators can use to build their own experiences.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's kind of it's a different design goal. And combined with this, like there's also a native creation toolkit. Like Horizon is as much a creation engine as it is a social VR platform.
So one thing I don't really get is the metaverse itself. I mean, I understand that, there's been things like this in the past, like a Second Life, PlayStation Home, things like that. This sounds like you were talking about more creator driven. It's a social platform. So take us into what the metaverse actually is.
Yeah. I described Horizon as a social VR platform initially because I'm always hesitant to use that word metaverse since it's just so overloaded and so in the media right now. But I think it's like very much still that definition of what a metaverse is, if this is an important definition at all, is kind of still being discussed, right? Like you ask 5 different people what they think a metaverse is, you'll get 5 different answers. But I think here is my attempt at like trying to consolidate what a metaverse is. And Horizon, the platform I was talking about, is Meta's first attempt at creating what a metaverse is. So I think for a platform to be considered a metaverse, it needs to have 3 features. The first feature, and there are 3 words in this feature, but it's actually just one feature, is I call it persistent and synchronously social. Persistent in the sense that with or without an individual, the metaverse exists. And this is different than like other social media platforms, right? Like Facebook or Instagram doesn't really exist without other people. But the metaverse is a virtual space that lives with or without you, the user. And it's synchronously social, as in I can have real-time interactions with other people on this platform. So it's not like an email system. The second aspect of what makes a metaverse is what we're discussing, which is UGC, user-generated content. I don't think a platform can be considered a metaverse if you have like one single entity or corporation that is building it. And I think this is where MMOs like Final Fantasy XIV or World of Warcraft are not metaverses because they're static spaces that users are not creating themselves. So we want the metaverse to be a rich space of expression for everyone. And finally, I think the third aspect of a metaverse is a customizable identity where you can come in and express who you want to be in this place. Like you create an avatar that is either an expression of you in real life or it is an entirely fabricated expression. And this identity transfers over from one world to another world. So yeah, I think this is my attempt at these 3 properties combined kind of starts to potentially get at what a metaverse is.
It's a totally new sort of deal. Like I said, there have been some things that have been similar to this in the past, but I don't think ever on this kind of level that you guys are creating right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are definitely other platforms, like you mentioned Second Life in the past. There's another VR platform called Rec Room that hits all of these 3, that hits the checklist. VR chat is potentially another platform that can be used that could qualify as a metaverse. Yeah, I think it's very, very exciting. I think there's lots of discussion on this in the media, obviously, and I think this is all like very, very healthy. But I think a lot of this conversation, this dialogue, is tainted with a lot of dystopian analogies, and I think the role of science fiction and dystopias are very important in this conversation, but I would personally, I guess I would love for there to be conferences that kind of discuss what are the problems this could help solve. Like apart from just letting corporations develop these for, I guess, monetary benefit, like what are real world problems that this can help address. And I don't mean to sound like a technotopian. Like, I don't think that technology solves all real world problems, and the private sector should not be sort of a proxy for government, but I think there are a lot of cool applications in that this could unlock. Like, I have a conversation with my parents who live like 5,000 miles away from me every week, and it's like on a small tiny screen on my phone. I could totally see that being a much more rich embodied experience where we're just doing cool new things, and that helps me keep in touch with them.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to look at it, because I think we're so inured by all the things that have come out in the past, 1984, Terminator, whatever, right? Where it's just like technology is going to be the end of us. That's like the immediate thing we all think about. But we also think about, like you're saying, how has technology helped us, right? Like technology has helped us a great deal. Like, how would you be talking to your parents if you couldn't, use the internet? You could use the phone, right? But it's like, how, you want to experience things with people and you're not always with them. So this gives you another way to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think another thing that like strikes me whenever I try anything in VR, like not just social VR, is that like VR is really cool, but it also reminds me of how amazing reality is. Like, I think a lot of dystopias are portrayed as like virtual spaces competing with reality, and I think this is all like really cool, rich ground for science fiction to cover. But I guess my concerns, at least in the short term, with things like metaverses are entirely different. I don't actually think that a virtual world can really compete with the beauty and the richness and the fidelity of reality,
Yeah. It's just another thing you can do. It doesn't supplant it.
Exactly. What I hope the metaverse becomes is something that like augments reality in a way that makes it better and kind of bridges gaps where reality is failing or is not enough.
I think that's a great way to look at it. So as a designer, what's important to you to give the player? Like, I feel like games are all about input output. But that input-output relationship to me is also based on what the designer puts into a game and what the player gets out of it. I'd just like to know sort of more about your design philosophy.
I think for starters, I really care about games or interactive experiences being accessible. I think our medium still has a lot of growing up to do in a way. Like, it is still a very new medium, but I think in order for games to truly realize their potential, they have to start appealing to a much broader set of demographics, which we see in a way. Like, we do see with the advent of mobile. Like, mobile reaches audiences like far beyond like what traditional console games or PC games did. But I think the type of content that we've seen on mobile is not necessarily as rich as other platforms. And when I say rich, I mean as a form of creative expression, as a potential and narrative delivery tool. So yeah, I think what I hope for, this is kind of, I never designed my career to have a trajectory. I've just kind of like gone where I've seen interesting work. But the only through line is that idea of accessibility. Like, Concrete Genie VR was, you don't have to have any level of skill. Like, you don't even have to identify as a gamer to experience that piece of content. Similarly, right, with the metaverse or Horizon. So I think like what excites me is often the touching points of the game world with the real world. Like, we build these incredible like universes and fantasy spaces, which are great. However, I think I just wish there were also more games that are about reality and real life. And where where those games exist, they are amazing. Like things like Papers, Please is a classic example of this. It's like, yeah, I want games to do more than entertain. I want games to inspire. I want them to evoke emotion and be an expression of people's identity.
Yeah, and I think like one of the games that did that for me was Flower. I remember playing that for the first time, and I gave it to my mom. Like her mother had just passed away, and I was like, "You should play this. This will relax you." And she doesn't like games at all. Like she played some games with me when I was a kid, but she was like, "Okay, I'll try it." And then she's like, "I love this game." She beat the whole thing like in one night. And she still talks about it. She's like, "Remember Flower?" I was like, "Of course I remember Flower." She's like, "Yeah, that's a game right there." I was like, "Yep."
That's the exact story I want to hear more of. Everything that game company does is phenomenal. Their studio's name is That Game Company. One of my favorite games is Journey.
Journey was great.
Their successor to Flower. I think Flower was amazing, but I think like Journey was a tipping off point to birth a whole genre of games that I've sometimes heard referred to as aesthetic games. Like other games along those lines are games like there's a game called Gris that is absolutely beautiful. It's an indie game made by, I want to say it was published by Devolver Games. I could be wrong though. But it's a game about a woman processing grief. And it's like loosely based on this psychological model of the 5 stages of grief that you go through.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And each stage is represented as a set of levels, and each has its own color palette and it adds a new mechanic. And this is what I mean by that touching point with reality.
Right. Because I think also like there's something about interactivity, and I don't think anyone's really cracked it yet to the point where it's fully realized, but when you do interactive storytelling in a way that doesn't rely on cutscenes, but comes from the actual interaction, that's when this medium, I think, from a storytelling standpoint, goes further than any other.
Absolutely. I think the action-adventure game formula is much more cutscene, gameplay, right?
Right.
And like we've discovered this to be a really powerful format in that it is like combining all of like film's known and tried methods of storytelling combined with gameplay. But it's not the only way to deliver narrative. And there are tons of games that explore this. Like I think another really great one is Disco Elysium. It just like creates a very narrative rich world that you experience by talking to different characters and that unlock certain quests. It's a phenomenal game.
Cool. Yeah, I have to check that out. And the 5 stages of grief one, that sounds like a really, really interesting title. Last thing I want to touch on is tell me about diversity in the games industry and your experience with that.
As I kind of mentioned, we spoke a little bit about this in the podcast, was I kind of have a unique identity in the sense that like I'm a person of color, I'm queer, and I'm also an immigrant. So I stand at the intersection of a lot of different identities, I guess. And I think what I want to say is a little bit more. I was thinking about. I think about this often, and what I want to, I guess, add to the narrative is not so much like all of the talks of diversity, which is happening already. Like I think, by and large, the games industry, while it still has a ways to go, is very slowly becoming a more diverse place. It's becoming like a place where you have lots of different types of identities expressed. But I think what is important to, I think, add to that narrative is describe like what exactly are the challenges involved in quote unquote like being yourself, because I think that often gets missed. Like we miss the subjective experience of like what people go through when they enter the industry. I think a lot of like the public narrative that we consume is like efforts to make the industry more diverse, and that's really, really important. But we should also not forget people's individual stories.
Right. It's like it's not like fulfilling a quota. It's actually trying to legitimately help people break into an industry.
Exactly. And I think another thing like I want to call out is that I don't want like my experience to sound like a victim narrative. Like it's absolutely not. Like in a way, I hold several privileges. Like I grew up with financial stability. I grew up with a family that cared about me. So I think like everything that I'm sharing now is much more a sense of like I hope other people who hear this feel recognized and feel validated, and not so much playing victim. But I think like the experience of being someone at the margins when you enter the industry is just that you become hyper conscious of yourself. Like when you're in a room with people who look and sound different than you, your attention is like so driven inwards. You become hyper conscious of your accent. You become hyper conscious of like your projected masculinity and femininity. You become conscious of your body language. You become very concerned about social cues, like where is it socially acceptable to interrupt? Where is it valid for one to speak? And I think the process of making games can sometimes like even exacerbate some of these things because people are passionate. And so like when you're in meetings where conversation is flowing very, very freely, and if you have a lot of your attention bandwidth being directed inwards, it's very hard to participate in those types of conversations. So I think the message to get out there is that like all of everything that you are, like the ways in which you wish to express yourself are all valid, and like you don't have to change. Like this sense of the hyper consciousness that you feel is an internal battle to overcome. And yeah, I think the faster and the more effectively we can help people overcome that type of hyper consciousness, the more they can be the best versions of themselves.
Is that something you still kind of wrestle with, or do you feel more comfortable with it?
I think I feel very, very comfortable being myself now. I think it's a journey for everyone, but I think I once again want to like call out privilege, like, and it's like so very important to account for your own privilege. Like I've been so fortunate in working with amazing people. Like we hear all these like horror stories of people in the games industry, and I think I've been like very shielded from all of that. Like I've worked with amazing people who recognize people's value in being who they are, and like just how important it is to empower everyone.
Right.
So yeah, I think I've had a lot of people who maybe not advertently, but have inadvertently like really helped me on my journey.
That's great. And I think it's a perfect place to wrap up here. Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. Is there anything you want to plug? Plug your book, plug whatever, plug any social media stuff. Now's the time, sir.
The book feels like it was written and published so long ago that it feels strange to plug that in. I'm also not really on social media very much. I think my only plug, if any, is for more people to play games. And if you are a gamer, like try and get your friends to play games. Introduce them to experiences that you think they would be interested in, and not just like experiences that you have fun with. I guess it's not so much of a plug as it is a soapbox, but there's my soapbox.
Hey, that's the time to do it. Well, thank you again, Nikhil, and we'd love to have you on again at some time, somewhere down the road. It's great talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Graham. Take care.
All right, that's going to wrap up this week's episode, and we want to thank Nikhil again for being our guest. To find out more about Mudstack, head over to mudstack.com, where you can learn everything there is to know about our product, where you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and join our Discord. And last but not least, we want to thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on Clear as Mud.